On the shifting frontier of early America, captivity was a fear that haunted every settlement. The conflicts that flared from the Ohio River Valley to the distant plains were not just wars over territory. They were wars fought through people, and women often became unwilling pieces on that brutal chessboard. Raids were sudden and swift, striking isolated cabins or wagon trains far from any fort protection. A door kicked open in the dead of night, a blaze rising from the barn, a scream drowned by musket fire. This was how captivity began for many, and when it did, the women taken knew the stories. They had heard them whisper around hearth fires and written in church pamphlets. Captives tortured, scalped, or worse. They expected pain, humiliation, perhaps a swift death. Few could imagine that what awaited them might be something far more complicated and far more human than they had been taught to believe. The wars that produced these encounters were varied. During the French and Indian War, native warriors allied with both European powers swept through frontier settlements, taking captives as part of strategies older than any colonial border. In the decades that followed, as the young United States pushed westward, conflicts like the Northwest Indian War and the Black Hawk War carried the same brutal logic. Villages burned, crops were seized, and women, often the wives and daughters of soldiers, farmers, or traders, were marched away into a world they did not understand. Yet this practice, to native nations, was not senseless cruelty. Captives had long been taken as compensation for losses in war, as replacements for relatives killed in battle, or as a means of strengthening kinship ties between communities. In those traditions, women were not merely spoils. They were potential members of a people, even potential mothers of new generations. For the women themselves, those first days were defined by terror. Forced marches could last for weeks, across forests and rivers, with little food and no sense of direction. They were often barefoot, disoriented, and sure that death awaited them once they reached their captors' villages. But as those journeys wore on, many noticed things they had not expected. Warriors who could have easily beaten or abused them instead shared their rations. At night, they were given furs to sleep on. Injured prisoners were treated with poultices and herbs. And when one stumbled or collapsed, a strong arm often helped them back to their feet. The fear did not vanish, but began to shift into confusion. That confusion deepened on arrival. Some captives were led into councils or ceremonial spaces rather than prisons. Others were bathed, their old clothes burned, and new garments placed on their shoulders, an act that symbolized not degradation but transformation. Women who expected to be beaten found themselves instead presented to elders, sometimes mourned as if they were the spirits of fallen relatives returning. They were given new names, new roles, and a choice they had never imagined would come: to remain and live among those they had been taught to fear. Of course, not all experiences were gentle. Some captives were treated harshly, especially when the wounds of war were fresh or when they resisted fiercely. But even in those cases, the brutality was often less than they had been prepared for, and far more bound by cultural norms than the unrestrained violence they had been warned about. For many, the most jarring realization was not that they were prisoners, but that they were being woven into society that viewed captivity through a very different lens, one that did not strip them of humanity, but instead attempted to reshape it. By the time many American women saw the distant outlines of their original homes again, if they returned at all, they carried stories that confounded their neighbors. Some spoke of kindness they could not explain, of children they had raised, of new families they had come to love. Others returned changed, bearing names that were not their own and refusing to answer to the ones they had been born with. And for those who never came back, their stories were carried on in the oral traditions of the people they joined, tales not of spoils taken in war, but of women who had crossed a cultural boundary and found a place, however unexpected, on the other side. From the moment settlers pushed beyond the safety of coastal towns and military forts, fear was woven into the fabric of frontier life. It lingered in the silence beyond the tree line and hummed beneath the hymns sung in small wooden churches. Women, especially, carried it with them in ways they rarely spoke aloud, a shadow stitched into every story they heard and every warning they were given. Newspapers in the East published sensational accounts of raids, filled with lurid details of women dragged from their homes, stripped of dignity, and murdered without mercy. Pamphlets distributed by churches and local militias urged vigilance, portraying native warriors as savage, godless, and bloodthirsty. Mothers told their daughters that to be captured was a fate worse than death. Even children playing near the edge of their settlements were told to remember that beyond the fields and fences lay a people who would scalp them alive or sell them into slavery. These stories were not simply warnings. They were lessons meant to shape behavior, to make obedience feel like safety. The military reinforced these fears with its own rhetoric. Officers briefing settler militias or frontier patrols painted captivity as an unthinkable outcome, urging men to fight to the last bullet rather than allow their wives or daughters to fall into enemy hands. During conflicts like the Pontiac War or the Creek War, captured soldiers' wives were described as defiled, tortured, or driven mad by cruelty. Officers' reports, often based on hearsay or exaggeration, circulated widely, repeated by newspapers hungry for sensational headlines and by preachers eager to frame the wars as battles between civilization and savagery. The more lurid the story, the more it served its purpose, to harden resolve, to justify expansion, and to ensure that fear remained stronger than curiosity. The rumors that spread among the settlers were often worse than the official accounts. In small frontier cabins and isolated homesteads, stories grew in the telling. A woman taken in one raid might be said to have been burned alive in another. A prisoner seen months later among a native community might be described as enslaved in a brothel or forced into unspeakable rituals. In many cases, the storytellers had no proof, only fragmented gossip, distorted memories, or assumptions rooted in prejudice. But the effect was real. These tales painted native people not as human beings with cultures and traditions, but as monsters lurking beyond the horizon, ready to inflict every cruelty imaginable. The psychological weight of that fear shaped how women imagined captivity long before they ever faced it. To them, it was not simply a matter of physical danger, but of spiritual annihilation. Being taken from one's home was portrayed as a fall from grace, a loss of purity, faith, and identity. Ministers warned that captives would be forced to renounce Christianity or bear children outside of marriage. Neighbors whispered that a woman who returned after years among native people could never truly be one of us again. The message was clear. Captivity did not end with rescue. It marked a woman forever, erasing the life she once knew. This constant barrage of imagery and instruction meant that when raids did happen, when doors splintered in the night and fire consumed the horizon, most women believed they knew what awaited them. They did not expect mercy. They did not expect to survive. The terror they felt as they were bound or led away was not only about what might happen, but about what they had been told would happen. Even those who managed to keep their composure during capture often broke down once the reality set in, convinced that every step toward the unknown was a step closer to suffering beyond endurance. What none of them could know was how different the reality often was. Their captors did not live by the twisted caricatures painted by colonial propaganda. They had their own laws of war, their own customs for dealing with captives, and their own reasons, practical, cultural, or spiritual, for how they treated those who fell into their hands. But at the moment of capture, those truths were still hidden, and fear was all the women had to guide them. It shaped their thoughts, hardened their expectations, and made every small act of kindness, a cup of water, a piece of bread, a word spoken softly in an unfamiliar tongue, feel like a bewildering contradiction. Only later, as captivity stretched from days into weeks and weeks into months, would many begin to understand how far the stories they had been told were from the complex, human reality that lay before them. The ordeal of captivity rarely ended with the violence of the raid itself. For many women, that moment was only the beginning of a far longer and more bewildering journey, a march into unfamiliar landscapes and uncertain fates that stretched for days or weeks without end. It began at dawn or under the light of a burning homestead, with little time to gather belongings or say goodbye. Often barefoot or half-dressed, they were hurried from the smoking remains of their homes and driven toward the western horizon. The terrain itself became an adversary. They trudged across muddy fields and stony ridges, through rivers that soaked their skirts and forests that tore at their clothes. Muscles ached, feet bled, and every breath carried a taste of fear. Yet the march did not feel like a random wandering. It was deliberate, purposeful, and ordered, a revelation in itself to captives who would imagine their captors as chaotic and lawless. The pace was grueling. Dictated by the need to put distance between the raiding party and any pursuing militia, silence was often enforced. Warriors communicated with hand signals or soft murmurs, and captives were warned with gesture or a look when noise might bring danger. At first, this silence deepened the terror. It felt like a prelude to something worse, a sign that brutality was coming once they were far from any chance of rescue. But as hours turned into days, patterns emerged that unsettled the assumptions the women had carried with them. They noticed, for instance, that they were not beaten for lagging behind. If one stumbled, a warrior sometimes slowed the pace or offered an arm to steady her. When rivers were crossed, captives were guided to shallower passages or even lifted onto a horse's back. It was not mercy in the way they had been taught to understand it. There was no soft voice of reassurance, no spoken promise of safety, but it was care of a kind, and it complicated the fear that had ruled their thoughts. Nights on the trail were the most difficult. Firelight revealed only fragments of the faces around them, and the strange language spoken by their captors felt like an impenetrable barrier. The women huddled together for warmth, whispering prayers or names of loved ones, trying to anchor themselves to a world that seemed to be slipping away. Yet even in the darkness, small gestures unsettled their expectations. Food was shared, roasted meat, dried corn, berries. Water was passed from one to another. When the temperature dropped, blankets or animal hides appeared, sometimes placed gently over sleeping captives without a word. These acts did not erase the reality that they were prisoners, but they hinted at a code of conduct that was alien to the image of merciless savages they had been raised to fear. The march was also an education in geography and endurance. Captives saw landscapes few Europeans had ever witnessed, endless prairies dotted with buffalo herds, rivers that wound like silver veins through the wilderness, and mountains rising like distant walls against the sky. At times the party moved with astonishing speed, covering miles with the precision of a well-trained column. At others, they lingered for days near a riverbank or a grove, resting and gathering food. These pauses were confusing. They offered moments of stillness that felt at odds with the desperate situation. Some women even found themselves watching their captors with a kind of reluctant curiosity, noticing how they moved silently through forests, how they read signs in the wind and the tracks of animals, how they treated one another with a mixture of discipline and mutual reliance. What surprised many most of all was the absence of certain cruelties they had prepared themselves to endure. There were no deliberate humiliations, no displays of violence meant solely to terrorize. The power dynamic was undeniable. They were captives without choice or freedom, but it was exercised with restraint that challenged everything they had been told. That restraint did not always mean kindness. Some captives were stern, others indifferent, but it was clear that they operated according to their own understanding of what captivity meant, one that often placed more emphasis on assimilation and integration than on punishment or destruction. By the time the march ended and the distant outline of a village or encampment appeared on the horizon, many women were exhausted beyond words. Yet they were also deeply unsettled, not just by what they had endured, but by what they had not. The terror that consumed them on the first day had not vanished. It lingered in every uncertain glance and every thought of what lay ahead, but it was now mixed with confusion, even reluctant gratitude. The road into captivity had not been the nightmare they expected. It was something stranger and harder to define, a passage through fear into a reality that refused to match the stories they had always believed. Hunger was one of the first truths of captivity. For women torn from their homes and driven westward into unfamiliar territory, the body's needs quickly became as urgent as fear. The shock of the raid, the exhaustion of the march, and the constant uncertainty of what would happen next all conspired to drain their strength. Many had eaten nothing since the morning of their capture, and they expected little mercy from those who held them. They imagined starvation as part of their punishment, a slow, deliberate cruelty meant to break their will and remind them of their helplessness. And yet, in the midst of their terror, something unexpected happened. On the second day of marching, or perhaps even before the first nightfall, food was offered. A piece of roasted venison passed from one set of hands to another, a strip of dried meat pressed gently into a captive's palm, a wooden bowl of corn mush set before her without a word. It was a small gesture, but one that shook the foundation of everything she had been taught to believe. At first, many refused to eat. Suspicion came naturally. They feared the food might be poisoned or that accepting it might be seen as submission. But hunger is a relentless teacher. As hours passed and the ache in their bellies deepened, the captives began to eat, some with hesitation, others with desperate hunger. And as they did, they noticed something that unsettled them even more. Their captors did not always eat first. In many groups, women and children received their share before warriors touched a bite. On cold nights, steaming portions of stew were handed to captives before the hunters who had brought down the deer tasted their own kill. These small acts did not erase the power imbalance, but they suggested a code of behavior, one in which prisoners were not treated as animals or spoils, but as people, even if they were outsiders. Water, too, was offered with a regularity that defied expectation. Captives recalled being guided to streams and creeks and encouraged to drink their fill. Some were given hollow gourds or animal skin bladders to carry water during the march. In rare instances, when rivers ran low or the terrain turned dry, warriors handed over the last of their own supply to those who could no longer walk without it. These were not the actions of men seeking to torment their prisoners. They were the habits of a people who saw captivity as a process, a transformation, rather than an annihilation. Shelter followed a similar pattern. When the party stopped for the night, fires were built and makeshift shelters were raised from hides, bark, or woven mats. Captives were not left exposed to the wind and rain. They were guided to the warmest places near the flames, sometimes even offered additional coverings against the chill. When storms rolled across the plains or snow fell thick in the forest, warriors doubled back to reinforce the shelters or check on those who were shivering. In many accounts, captives were startled to find themselves treated with a kind of quiet attentiveness they had not expected from people they had been taught to hate and fear. The most profound shock came not from a single gesture, but from the pattern they formed. None of these actions were accompanied by explanations or demands for gratitude. They were simply done, as though they were part of the natural order. For women raised on stories of savagery, this was deeply disorienting. They had imagined their captors as brutes who took pleasure in suffering. Instead, they encountered people who, while firm in their control and clear about their dominance, also adhered to customs that placed value on sustaining life, even the lives of those they had captured. It did not make captivity any less frightening, but it complicated the fear, filling it with questions that had no easy answers. In time, these acts of humanity began to erode the sharpest edges of terror. A woman who had once trembled at the thought of being starved to death now found herself warmed by a shared fire. Another who had wept over the idea of dying of thirst now carried a water skin given to her by the same man who had raided her home. These moments did not erase the pain of what had been taken from them, their families, their freedom, their future, but they planted a seed of something unexpected. The possibility that their captors were not monsters, but human beings guided by principles as real and deeply held as any sermon preached back east. And once that realization took root, the journey ahead could never look quite the same. What startled many captive women most was not just how they were fed or sheltered, but how little physical restraint was ever placed upon them. In their minds, captivity had always been pictured as iron, shackles on their wrists, collars around their necks, barred wagons rolling toward distant stockades. That was how prisoners were handled in European wars, and that was how American militias treated their own captives. With chains, walls, and watchtowers, the physical weight of confinement pressed into flesh and bone. Yet on the long march west, and even after they reached their captors' villages, most women found none of these things waiting for them. There were no cages, no manacles, no soldiers standing guard with muskets at the ready. Instead, they were watched, not with weapons, but with eyes that were always present yet rarely threatening, as if the captors assumed that the captives would remain with them of their own accord. At first, this lack of restraint only deepened their confusion and fear. Some believed it was a cruel trick, that they were being lulled into a false sense of safety before something worse was planned. Others assumed their captors were so certain of their power that they saw no need for physical bonds. But as days turned into weeks, it became clear that this was no oversight. It was a deliberate choice rooted in a different understanding of captivity itself. Among many native nations, prisoners were not simply enemies to be contained. They were potential members of a community, people who might, through time and ritual, become kin. And kin were not treated like livestock. This philosophy shaped every detail of how captives were handled. During travel, they were expected to walk freely with the group, often given a place near the center of the line rather than forced to march at the rear under guard. They were sometimes allowed to gather firewood or fetch water without supervision. At campsites, no sentries hovered over them while they slept. Escape was possible, at least in theory, and some tried. But many found that the wilderness itself was a far more formidable prison than their captors. Without knowledge of the land or the direction of their home, most who fled were quickly recaptured or chose to return on their own, exhausted and lost. Those who were caught were rarely executed or beaten as punishment. Instead, they were spoken to firmly, reminded of their place within the group, and once again treated with the same watchful tolerance. For many women, this treatment was more unsettling than chains would have been. Restraints would confirm the worldview they had brought with them, a world divided neatly into captor and captive, ruler and prisoner. But trust was harder to interpret. It blurred those boundaries. It implied that their captors did not see them as threats or as property, but as human beings whose choices still mattered. It forced them to confront the uncomfortable reality that they were not being held solely by force, but also by circumstance, by the vastness of the land, and in time, by subtle bonds of dependence that began to form. The absence of visible confinement also reshaped the relationships between captors and captives. Instead of barking orders, warriors used gestures or simple words to direct movement. Instead of guards standing apart, they walked beside the women, speaking occasionally, sharing food, or pointing out features of the landscape. Over time, this closeness became part of the daily rhythm of captivity. Women began to recognize individuals among their escorts, to learn their names, and to understand fragments of their language. They discovered personalities, some stern and silent, others quietly humorous, and in doing so, the faceless image of the savage enemy crumbled a little more each day. The trust extended to captives also carried a subtle message about power. It demonstrated a confidence born not of arrogance, but of cultural certainty. These were people who did not need walls to assert control, because their authority came from something deeper, from tradition, from communal cohesion, from an understanding of the land that outsiders could not match. The captives were outsiders, but they were also guests in a sense, and guests were guided, not caged. By the time many women reached their captors' villages, they had grown accustomed to this strange freedom within captivity. It was still captivity. Their choices were limited, their futures uncertain, but it did not feel like the imprisonment they had feared. Instead, it felt like being held within the gravity of another world, one where the rules they had always known did not apply. That absence of chains, more than any act of kindness or cruelty, began to change how they saw their captors and how they understood themselves. It revealed a society confident enough in its power to offer trust instead of terror. And in doing so, it began to chip away at the very idea of what it meant to be a prisoner. For many women, the greatest shock of captivity came not during the march nor in the daily routines that followed, but in the moments when they were no longer treated as prisoners at all. After weeks or months in their captor's presence, after hunger, exhaustion, and fear had dulled into a kind of uneasy acceptance, they were suddenly thrust into ceremonies that seemed to invert everything they had known about war and conquest. These were not acts of humiliation or punishment. They were rituals of transformation, deliberate, solemn gestures meant to erase the line between outsider and insider, to turn an enemy into something entirely different, a guest, a family member, even a replacement for someone who had been lost. The process often began with cleansing, a ritual deeply rooted in spiritual belief. Women were led to rivers or streams and instructed to wash themselves thoroughly, sometimes with the help of other women from the village. Their hair might be combed and braided, their faces painted with symbols whose meanings they did not yet understand. In some nations, herbs were burned beside the water, the smoke believed to purify the soul and prepare the captive for a new beginning. The clothes they had worn since their capture, torn, dirty reminders of their former life, were taken away, sometimes burned. In their place came new garments made by their captors, often decorated with beadwork or designs particular to the clan that was adopting them. This was not meant as mere kindness. It was a symbolic shedding of the past. Everything that had belonged to their old identity, their names, their homes, their allegiances, was left behind with the garments that went into the fire. The ceremonies that followed were often even more elaborate. Among the Haudenosaunee, for example, captives were sometimes formally adopted into a clan as replacements for relatives who had died in war or from disease. The grieving family might speak the name of the deceased aloud before turning to the captive and giving that name to her as her own. In that moment, she was no longer a prisoner but a daughter or sister, expected to live in a household as if she had always been there. Other nations held feasts to mark the transition, offering the newly adopted woman a place of honor beside elders or chiefs. She might be presented with gifts, a blanket, a cooking pot, a necklace, each carrying symbolic weight as signs of belonging. The people gathered around her would address her not as a captive but as kin, a gesture that carried with it obligations on both sides. She was now part of the community, and the community, in turn, bore responsibility for her welfare. The naming itself was one of the most profound moments. Names in many native cultures carried meanings beyond simple identity. They connected a person to ancestors, to the natural world, to spiritual forces. Receiving a new name meant more than starting a new life. It meant being woven into a story larger than oneself. Some women resisted this, clinging fiercely to their birth names and the sense of self they represented. Others, often after years in captivity, came to embrace the names they had been given, even using them when speaking with those from their former lives. To outsiders, these rituals were often misunderstood or dismissed as primitive theater. But to those who experienced them, they were transformative in ways that could not be undone. They were not merely gestures of mercy or signs of power. They were declarations of intention, a statement that the captive was no longer an outsider to be feared or pitted, but a person with a place, a role, and a future. Even those who longed for freedom found their identities complicated by these ceremonies. Some spoke later feeling torn between worlds, bound not by chains but by bonds of affection and duty they had not expected to form. In a world defined by conquest and displacement, these rituals revealed a very different way of thinking about war and its aftermath. They suggested that victory was not always about extermination or domination, but about integration and renewal. Lives lost in battle could be symbolically restored through adoption. Wounds inflicted by violence could be healed, at least in part, by weaving former enemies into the fabric of the community. For the women who underwent them, the ceremonies of acceptance were not just cultural curiosities. They were turning points, moments when captivity ceased to be a simple matter of survival and became something more complex, more ambiguous, and, for some, more permanent. The transformation from captive to family member did not happen all at once. It was not marked solely by ceremonies or symbolic gestures, but by the slow, steady weaving of daily life, a web of kinship that grew strand by strand until it was difficult to see where the bonds of coercion ended and the ties of belonging began. For many women, the first sign of this shift came when they were placed in households rather than confined to separate quarters. Instead of being treated as outsiders to be watched, they were given roles to fill, cooking beside other women, tending gardens, caring for infants, fetching water, and gathering firewood. These were tasks they had done all their lives, yet in this new context they carried deeper meaning. Through them, captives were not just performing labor. They were learning rhythms, customs, and relationships that gradually tethered them to the community around them. In many cases, these roles deepened into something far more personal. Women who had lost their own families were often adopted into clans as daughters, sisters, or even wives. Elders might introduce them to the extended kin network, explaining who was responsible for what, how disputes were settled, and where they fit into the social order. Children, curious and unburdened by the politics of war, were usually the first to accept them fully. They followed them as they worked, asked them questions in halting attempts at communication, and pulled them into games and laughter. In time, captives found themselves teaching as much as they were learning, passing on sewing techniques, sharing recipes, or showing how to mend tools. Language, once a barrier, became a bridge as words and phrases were traded back and forth until they could speak enough to be understood. Motherhood, in particular, became one of the most powerful forces in binding captives to their new lives. Some women who had lost children of their own found themselves raising others, orphans left by war, babies given to them as part of their adoption, or, in some cases, children born from marriages arranged within the community. These children became more than dependents. They were the embodiment of a new identity, one that could not be easily severed even if freedom were offered. The bond between a mother and a child transcended the circumstances of captivity, and many women who might once have dreamed of returning home found themselves unable to imagine leaving the children they had come to love. The integration worked in the other direction as well. Families did not merely tolerate these new members. They invested in them emotionally and socially. A woman who had once been considered an enemy might be called daughter or sister with genuine affection. She might be entrusted with responsibilities that carried status and trust, such as overseeing a harvest or participating in ceremonial preparations. As her place in the family solidified, the idea of her as a prisoner faded. Not erased entirely, but softened into a chapter of her past rather than the defining feature of her present. This process often created profound internal conflicts. Many women felt deep loyalty to their birth families and cultures, even as they grew to love the people who had taken them in. Letters and narratives written after repatriation reveal the complexity of their feelings. Some spoke of their captors with admiration and respect, crediting them with kindness and wisdom. Others confessed that returning to their former lives felt disorienting, that they missed the community they had left behind. There were even women who refused to return when the opportunity arose, choosing instead to remain with the families they had built in captivity. Such decisions baffled colonial officials and enraged families back east, but to the women themselves, they were not betrayals. They were acknowledgments of a truth that outsiders could not understand, that identity could stretch and change until two worlds could exist within one person. Over time, these blended lives had wider consequences than anyone could have foreseen. Children born to women who had once been captives grew up with dual inheritances, carrying stories, skills, and traditions from both cultures. They acted as interpreters and intermediaries, guiding negotiations, facilitating trade, and bridging the gap between communities that otherwise viewed one another with suspicion. In this way, the experience of captivity did more than alter individual lives. It reshaped entire networks of kinship and diplomacy, creating human connections where once there had been only hostility. The blurring of the line between prisoner and relative was perhaps the most subversive outcome of all. It undermined colonial narrative of a reconcilable difference and exposed a deeper reality, that even amid war and violence, people could find ways to build families, share knowledge, and create bonds that defied the logic of conquest. What began as an act of force often ended in an act of choice, a choice to stay, to love, and to belong. And in that choice lay a quiet revolution that neither musket nor treaty could ever fully contain. As the days of captivity stretched into weeks and the routines of survival became familiar, night brought a different kind of education, one that no colonial sermon, pamphlet, or military manual had ever prepared these women for. Around the glow of campfires, when the work of the day was done in the forest, quieted into a chorus of distant night calls, a world of stories unfolded. It was here in the flicker of firelight and the gentle murmur of shared voices that many captives first encountered the depth of the culture they had been taught to despise. The same people they had once feared as merciless warriors revealed themselves as storytellers, philosophers, historians, and poets. The line between civilized and savage, so sharply drawn in the society they had left behind, began to blur and dissolve. The evenings were rarely structured, yet they followed a rhythm. Elders would gather the younger members of the community and settle them near the fire, their faces lit in soft orange light, and begin to speak. Some stories were ancient, tales of how the world had been formed from water and sky, of spirits who walked the earth before humans, of animals who taught people how to survive. Others recounted the origins of their people, migrations across rivers, battles fought and lost, treaties made and broken. The stories were not merely entertainment. They were lessons, binding each listener to a lineage of memory and meaning. Even those who could not understand the words felt the weight of them, the cadence, the repetition, the reverence with which names and places were spoken. Slowly, over many nights, captives began to recognize familiar words and phrases, then whole sentences. Language, which had once been a barrier, became a bridge. They asked questions. They told their own stories in halting phrases, and the people around the fire listened patiently. sometimes laughing gently at their mispronunciations, sometimes nodding with quiet respect. What surprised many was the tone of these gatherings. There was humor, tenderness, and wisdom woven into the stories, qualities they had never been told existed in savage cultures. Elders poked fun at trickster spirits who embodied human folly. Heroes were not always warriors. Sometimes they were women who brokered peace, healers who saved lives, or children who saw truths that adults ignored. Morality was not preached from on high, but demonstrated through metaphor and narrative. The lessons were familiar, even universal. Courage in the face of adversity, generosity toward the vulnerable, respect for the natural world. The captives began to recognize echoes of their own religious teachings, though expressed in a language and form entirely different from what they had known. In these firelit circles, the exchange was not one-sided. The captives, too, were invited to share. They spoke of towns with tall wooden steeples, of ships larger than houses, of distant cities whose names were strange to their hosts. They told Bible stories, folk tales from Europe, and accounts of their own ancestors. Sometimes the listeners reacted with disbelief, sometimes with fascination, sometimes with polite silence. But the act of telling itself forged a kind of mutual curiosity. Each side saw in the other something more complex than the caricatures they had carried into the encounter. It was also around these fires that many women first heard their captors speak about them, not as enemies or trophies, but as individuals with their own spirits, strengths, and potential. They heard elders reflect on the meaning of war, on the pain of loss, on the possibility of reconciliation. These conversations were often indirect, couched in metaphor and story rather than blunt speech, but their intent was unmistakable. They revealed a worldview that prized balance over conquest, relationship over domination. The captives, who had once seen themselves as victims of a violent people, began to grasp that they were part of a larger narrative, one in which violence was only one chapter. For some women, these campfire evenings mark a profound shift in their identity. They no longer felt like mere outsiders peering in on a strange and hostile world. They became participants in the shared act of remembering and imagining, contributors to a living tradition that stretched back centuries. Even when they could not fully understand the language, they understood the humanity in the voices that spoke it. And in that understanding, the categories that had once seemed so clear, civilized and savage, conqueror and conquered, us and them, lost their power. When they later told their stories, many former captives would speak less of battles and marches than of these nights by the fire. They described the faces illuminated by flame, the warmth of shared laughter, the reverence with which ancestors were invoked. They spoke of the moment they realized that the people they had feared were not so different from themselves, that beneath the scars of conflict and the weight of history, they too dreamed, remembered, taught, and hoped. It was in those quiet, glowing circles that many women's understanding of the world was rewritten, and once rewritten, it could never be turned back. In every story Captivity, there were those who could not bring themselves to accept their new reality, no matter how many days or months passed. Some carried the image of home like a burning coal, refusing to let fade even when the horizon offered no sign of return. Others acted on impulse, driven by panic, grief, or the simple conviction that any chance, however small, was better than surrender. Escape attempts were not rare. They happened under cover of darkness, during the confusion of a storm, or in the brief moments when the camp seemed unwatched. Women slipped away silently, retracing their steps along familiar rivers, following the stars eastward, or stumbling blindly through forests they had never known. Many believed that if they were caught, they would pay a brutal price, beaten, mutilated, or executed as traitors. That was what colonial courts would have done to deserters or rebels. But the punishment they imagined rarely came. Most escape attempts ended quickly. The land itself was a formidable jailer, vast, unfamiliar, and indifferent to human desperation. Captives often underestimated the distances between villages or the difficulty of surviving alone in the wilderness without supplies. Some collapsed from hunger and exhaustion within a day. Others were tracked and overtaken by warriors who moved through the forests with silent precision. But when they were brought back, something surprising happened. They were not stripped and flogged before the community. They were not shackled or branded as examples. Instead, they were spoken to, sometimes sternly, sometimes almost gently, and then reintegrated into daily life. The experience was meant to teach, not to destroy. This response reflected a philosophy deeply rooted in many native traditions. Punishment was less about vengeance than about restoring balance. A runaway captive was not viewed as a criminal so much as a person who had not yet understood their place in the new social order. Violence might have satisfied anger, but it would not serve the deeper purpose of turning an outsider into a functioning member of the community. Rehabilitation, through patience, teaching, and example, offered a better path. In some cases, escapees were given new responsibilities, trusted with tasks that required them to rely on the group. In others, they were placed under the watch of elders or family members who worked to build bonds of trust. The underlying message was consistent. Resistance would not sever the ties being built, and rebellion would not be met with cruelty, but with persistence. This approach bewildered many women. They had been taught that rebellion must always be crushed, that authority demanded visible displays of punishment to maintain order. Colonial society had prisons, whipping posts, and gallows for precisely this reason. Yet here, authority seemed secure without them. It was as if their captors believed that power did not require fear, that it was stronger when exercised with restraint. For some, this realization was deeply disarming. It robbed them of the righteous hatred they had clung to, forcing them to see their captors as more than oppressors. It also revealed a subtle confidence. The knowledge of their hold over the captive's life was so complete that they did not need to prove it with violence. Not every attempt ended without consequence. Those who repeatedly tried to flee or who endangered others in the process might find themselves under closer watch or excluded from certain responsibilities. But even then, the punishments were measured and purposeful, aimed at guiding rather than breaking. One woman, recaptured 3 times, later recalled that each time she was brought back, the same elder visited her tent and told her stories about journeys that ended not in triumph but in understanding. At the time, she had dismissed them as nonsense. Years later, she recognized them as a form of teaching, a way to make her see that the path she was on led nowhere. The long-term effect of this approach was profound. Many captives who once plotted daily escape eventually abandoned the idea, not because they had given up hope of freedom, but because their relationship with their captors had changed. The absence of violence softened their hostility. The patience shown toward their rebellion built a reluctant respect. Over time, they ceased to see themselves as prisoners waiting for a chance to run, and began to see themselves as people with place, however unexpected, in a world that had once seemed only hostile. This philosophy of restraint did more than shape individual fates. It challenged the very logic of colonial power. It suggested that authority need not rely on terror to sustain itself, and that rebellion could be met not with annihilation, but with transformation. And in that quiet, paradoxical lesson lay one of the deepest surprises of captivity. That freedom was not always taken by force, and captivity was not always maintained by chains. Sometimes, the strongest control came from the decision not to crush resistance, but to patiently outlast it. For many captive women, the most difficult part of life among their captors was not the physical hardship or even the loss of freedom. It was the daily collision of worlds. Every assumption they had carried from childhood, every unspoken rule of what was proper, sacred, or natural, was suddenly thrown into question. In this new environment, gestures that had once seemed polite were misunderstood, acts of respect were dismissed as arrogance, and deeply held beliefs collided in ways that neither side fully understood. These cultural clashes, often subtle and slow-burning, shaped the experience of captivity just as powerfully as hunger or fear. Spiritual practices were among the first and most bewildering differences. Many of the women had grown up in Protestant or Catholic households, where worship was confined to churches, hymns, and scripture. Faith was something structured and formal, led by clergy and governed by doctrine. Among their captors, religion was everywhere, woven into daily life, inseparable from the natural world. Ceremonies were held in the open air, prayers offered to rivers, mountains, and animals as living beings. Smoke from sacred fires carried word skyward, and dances told stories of creation and memory. Some captives found these practices beautiful. Others recoiled, convinced they were witnessing idolatry or witchcraft. Missionaries and colonial authorities had long taught that such rituals were evidence of savagery and heathenism, And even when the women saw kindness and reverence in them, their upbringing made acceptance difficult. At times, their refusal to participate caused quiet tension. A woman might refuse to join a ceremonial meal, or she might cross herself in defiance as songs rose into the night. To her hosts, such behavior could be confusing or insulting, a rejection not just of their beliefs but of the community itself. Gender roles were another constant source of misunderstanding. In colonial society, women were expected to be subordinate, to obey fathers and husbands, to confine their labor to the domestic sphere, and to leave leadership to men. Among many native nations, roles were more fluid and often more balanced. Women held significant authority in decisions about land, resources, and family. Clan mothers chose chiefs and could remove them from power. Female healers and storytellers carried spiritual weight equal to that of male warriors. To some captives, these dynamics were deeply unsettling. A woman speaking boldly in council or commanding respect in public contradicted everything they had been taught about proper female behavior. At the same time, their own reluctance to speak or act independently sometimes frustrated their hosts, who expected them to contribute actively to communal life. One captive later wrote of being gently scolded by an elder for acting like a shadow, a metaphor for passivity that carried an implicit invitation to step forward and be seen. Even the rhythms of daily life became battlegrounds of expectation. Work was organized collectively, and the boundaries between men's and women's responsibilities did not align neatly with European customs. Captives were sometimes shocked to see men participating in cooking or child-rearing, or women wielding tools to build shelters or defend the village. The communal approach to property, in which resources were shared rather than owned individually, was equally foreign. Women who had grown up in a culture where possessions defined status found it difficult to understand a society where generosity, not accumulation, was the measure of honor. Disputes occasionally arose when captives clung to their possessions or hesitated to share food or tools. To their hosts, this behavior seemed selfish. To the captives, it felt like survival. Language deepened these tensions. Even as many women learned enough words to communicate, meanings often slipped through the cracks. Concepts like sin ownership or obedience did not translate easily into their captors' languages, which often emphasized relationships and balance over rigid categories. Misunderstandings were inevitable. A question might be heard as an accusation. A polite refusal might sound like contempt. These small missteps could ripple into larger conflicts, leaving both sides bewildered and frustrated. Yet, beneath the friction, something more complex was taking place. Each misunderstanding forced the captives to reconsider what they had always accepted as natural or inevitable. A ceremony dismissed as superstition began to reveal its own deep logic. A society they had viewed as chaotic showed intricate systems of responsibility and reciprocity. A woman they once saw as unruly embodied a kind of authority they had never known was possible. Even when they resisted these revelations, they could not unsee them. And in the process, their own sense of identity shifted, often in ways they could not yet name. These cultural collisions did not always end in harmony. Some captives remained outsiders to the end, unable or unwilling to bridge the divide. But for many, the friction itself became transformative. It stripped away the certainty of their old world and replaced it with something humbler, a recognition that civilized and savage were not fixed truths but shifting perspectives, shaped by where one stood. In that realization, even conflict became a form of learning, and misunderstanding a doorway to a deeper understanding of humanity itself. The end to captivity was rarely the end of the story. For many women, their return to colonial society, if it came at all, marked the beginning of a far more complicated chapter. They did not return unchanged. They carried with them memories that refused to fit neatly into the simple narratives their communities expected. They had seen the faces of those they once called enemies, shared meals with them, heard their stories, and in some cases, been folded into their families. That experience, as disorienting as it was transformative, often left them with perspective few others possessed, one that would prove invaluable in times of fragile peace and bitter negotiation. Through their voices, the echoes of captivity shaped alliances, treaties, and even the course of wars. Some of the earliest examples emerged in the wake of conflicts like the French and Indian War, when captives who had lived for years among native nations became intermediaries in the uneasy peace that followed. Women who spoke both English and Iroquoian or Algonquian languages found themselves called upon by colonial authorities to serve as translators. But translation was only part of their role. They understood cultural nuance, the layered meanings behind gestures, silences, and metaphors in ways that formal diplomats did not. They could explain why a particular phrase might be taken as an insult, why a certain gift was necessary before talks could begin, or why a meeting had to take place on neutral ground. This deeper cultural literacy often made the difference between failure and fragile progress. Others used their influence more directly. Mary Jemison, one of the most well-documented captives of the 18th century, was taken by Seneca warriors as a teenager during the French and Indian War, and later chose to remain with them even when offered a chance to return. Over decades, she became a respected figure within the community. Her unique position allowed her to act as a bridge between worlds. Colonial officials and native leaders alike sought her counsel, and she helped mediate disputes that might otherwise have led to violence. Her voice carried weight not because of her European origins or her fluency in English, but because she had lived the complexity of both worlds and earned trust in both. Not all such figures were as famous, but their impact was no less significant. In countless frontier towns and trading posts, unnamed women who had once been captives facilitated exchanges of goods, information, and diplomacy. Some persuaded wary colonial officials to pursue negotiation instead of punitive expeditions, drawing on their first-hand knowledge of native customs to argue that peace was possible. Others advised native leaders on how to frame demands in terms colonial authorities could accept. A few even played roles in formal treaty councils, where their presence served as living proof that coexistence, however difficult, was not beyond reach. The influence of these women was not always welcomed. Colonial society, shaped by rigid ideas of loyalty and identity, often viewed them with suspicion. Their sympathy for native peoples was seen as betrayal, their insistence on compromise as weakness. Some were accused of having gone native and were ostracized from their former communities. Yet even those who faced rejection continued their work quietly, believing that the lessons learned in captivity about humanity, trust, and the possibility of mutual respect were too important to ignore. For native nations, too, the voices of former captives were often powerful. Their presence demonstrated that alliances with Europeans were not merely strategic but personal, forged through bonds of kinship as well as diplomacy. When these women spoke of the kindness or restraint they had experienced, they challenged stereotypes that painted native peoples as irredeemably savage. When they spoke of broken promises and betrayals by colonial authorities, they gave weight to demands for accountability and fair treatment. Their testimonies, born from lived experience rather than secondhand rumor, were difficult to dismiss. The legacy of these alliances extended beyond the immediate aftermath of war. They laid the groundwork for future generations of negotiation, shaping patterns of diplomacy that would persist for decades. Even as expansion and conflict continued, the idea that former enemies could become partners, that understanding could emerge from violence, remained a thread running through the complex tapestry of frontier relations. The women who had once been captives carried that thread, weaving it into the fragile fabric of peace. Their influence was a testament to the power of lived experience. They had endured fear, loss, and transformation, and in doing so, they had gained insight that no soldier or statesman could match. By translating not just words but worlds, by advocating for empathy in places ruled by suspicion, they helped shape the course of history in ways few could have imagined on the day they were taken from their homes. Captivity had begun as a wound, but for some, it became a bridge, a way to cross divides that had once seemed impossible to span. For colonial families and officials who spent months or even years petitioning for the return of captives, nothing was more bewildering or more scandalous than the women who, when given a chance to leave, refused. It was expected that the end of captivity would be a moment of relief, a joyous homecoming after suffering and separation. Yet again and again, accounts surfaced of women who chose not to cross back over the threshold of their former lives. They stood before emissaries carrying promises of safe passage. They listened to pleas from relatives and clergy, and then they shook their heads. For the society that had raised them, These choices were incomprehensible, even monstrous. But for the women themselves, the reasons were often painfully simple. What had once been foreign had become home. The first shock came during prisoner exchanges and peace negotiations, where colonial agents assumed that all captives would leap at the chance of return. Instead, some stepped forward to say they would remain with their adoptive families. Mary Jemison, perhaps the most famous of these women, embodied this choice. Captured as a teenager and adopted by a Seneca family, she built a life among them, marrying, raising children, and earning a place of respect within the community. Years later, when offered repatriation, she declined without hesitation. She had forgotten much of her native language, she explained, and she could not imagine living among people who were now strangers. Her home, her family, and her future were with the Seneca. To her former neighbors, this was unthinkable. To her, it was inevitable. Mary was not alone. Countless other women, their names mostly lost to history, made similar decisions. Some had been captured as children and no longer remembered their birth families. Others had formed bonds so deep with their adoptive relatives that leaving felt like betrayal. Many had married and borne children, and the thought of abandoning them for a world that might reject both mother and offspring was unbearable. Even those who had initially resisted their new lives often found that, over time, familiarity had woven a powerful web. The rhythms of village life, planting and harvesting, ceremonies and storytelling, shared labor and shared meals, became not just routines but a source of identity. Returning to colonial society, with its rigid hierarchies, judgment, and suspicion, seemed less like a rescue than an exile. The choices of these women ignited outrage in the colonies. Ministers thundered from pulpits that they had been corrupted, their souls tainted by heathen ways. Newspapers described them as lost or fallen, casting their decisions as evidence of weakness or moral decay. Families, humiliated and bewildered, often disowned them. Some communities even spread rumors that the women had been bewitched or brainwashed, unwilling to believe that they had chosen freely. The colonial worldview could not accommodate the idea that life among native nations, portrayed for generations as savage and inferior, could be preferable to the comforts of European civilization. Yet behind that outrage lay deeper anxieties. These women's choices revealed cracks in the colonial narrative. They showed that the divide between civilized and savage was not as stark as settlers wanted to believe. They demonstrated that native societies offered forms of community, purpose, and autonomy that colonial life often denied, particularly to women. Within many native nations, women had more authority over land, family decisions, and political matters than they ever could have imagined in their former lives. They were valued as leaders, healers, and decision-makers, roles that colonial society reserved for men. To leave that behind was, for some, unthinkable. The presence of these women also created awkward diplomatic moments. At treaty councils, colonial negotiators were embarrassed when former captives stood beside native leaders as spouses or advisors. Their very existence undermined the image of European superiority and challenged the notion that captivity was solely a tale of suffering. Instead, it became clear that, for some, captivity had evolved into belonging, and that belonging was strong enough to outweigh loyalty to blood or birthplace. Even decades later, their choices continued to haunt colonial memory. They were written about as cautionary tales or as proof of moral failure, their names spoken with pity or contempt. But beneath those judgments lay an undeniable truth. They had exercised agency in a world that sought to deny them any. They had chosen their own lives, even when those choices defied every expectation and cost them their reputations. And in doing so, they revealed something that colonial society could not easily admit, that humanity, love, and purpose were not confined to one culture, one faith, or one way of life. For those women, captivity had not ended with their refusal to leave. It had transformed into something else entirely, not a prison, but a home they had built for themselves, on their own terms. When word reached colonial towns and cities that some female captives had not only survived but had chosen to remain with the very people who had taken them, the reaction was explosive. It was not simply disbelief. It was outrage, scandal, and something deeper, fear. The newspapers that once printed breathless accounts of daring rescues and miraculous escapes now filled their pages with accusations. Ministers thunder from their pulpits that these women have been seduced by heathen ways, corrupted beyond recognition. Families, unable to reconcile what had happened, search for explanations that would make sense within the strict framework of their world. The result was a frenzy of public condemnation designed to reclaim the narrative, to turn choices that undermine colonial assumptions into evidence of weakness, madness, or manipulation. Newspapers played a central role in shaping this backlash. Articles appear with sensational headlines, portraying the women as victims of cunning psychological schemes. Writers claim that they had been bewitched by ceremonies and rituals, their wills broken by strange medicines and chants. Others argue that they had been enslaved in spirit, even if they appeared free in body. Any signs of contentment or affection for their captors were dismissed as proof of Stockholm-like delusion, not conscious choice. When Mary Jemison's story became known, for example, some editors suggested that she must have been spiritually poisoned, unable to see that she was living in barbarism. It was easier to believe she had been brainwashed than to consider that she had simply found meaning and belonging in a world that settlers had always dismissed as inferior. Churches were even harsher. For clergy steeped in the idea of Christian civilization as the pinnacle of human development, the refusal of a woman to return home was nothing short of apostasy. Sermons described the women as having forsaken God for idols, and pamphlets circulated warning that their souls were in peril. Ministers told their congregations that the captives had been lured away from the faith by pagan ceremonies and the false kindness of their captors. Some even suggested that native communities intentionally targeted women because they were weaker vessels, easier to corrupt and turn into agents of subversion. The fact that many of these women had been treated with dignity and given real agency in their new societies was twisted into a sinister plot, evidence of manipulation rather than humanity. Families of the captives, caught between grief and humiliation, often joined in the chorus of condemnation. To admit that their daughters, sisters, or wives had chosen to stay would have meant questioning everything they believed about their own way of life. It would have meant acknowledging that the so-called savages had offered something that the colonial world could not, and so they clung to alternative explanations, that their loved ones had been coerced, that they were too traumatized to make rational decisions, that they would one day come to their senses and return. When those returns never came, families sometimes disowned the women entirely, erasing their names from family records as if they had died. The language of betrayal was everywhere. Politicians and pamphleteers accused the women of turning their backs on their country, their religion, and their race. In a society that defined itself in opposition to the native nations it sought to displace, their choices were seen as treasonous. It was not merely that they had crossed a cultural line. It was that they had exposed how porous that line truly was. Their lives testified to the possibility that the supposed inferiority of native societies was a lie. And that possibility was more dangerous than any raid or ambush. It threatened the ideological foundation on which colonial expansion was built. To protect that foundation, kindness itself had to be reinterpreted. Acts of generosity toward captives, the sharing of food, the offering of names, the adoption into families, were framed as tools of control. Missionaries warned that such gestures were meant to ensnare the unwary, that beneath every gift was a hidden snare. Even the restraint shown to those who tried to escape was recast as a calculated tactic, designed to confuse and weaken the will. By painting compassion as manipulation, colonial leaders could preserve their moral superiority while explaining away the uncomfortable fact that their enemies often treated captives more humanely than they did. The outrage served another purpose too. It was a warning. It reminded other captives and society at large that crossing the cultural divide, even emotionally or intellectually, was unacceptable. Those who returned were expected to denounce their captors in public and reaffirm their loyalty to their own people. Anything less invited suspicion. The women who refused to do so became symbols of disloyalty, their names invoked in sermons and political speeches as examples of what happened when one strayed too far from civilization. Yet beneath all the accusations, betrayals, and attempts to rewrite the story, an unease remained. The fury betrayed a truth that no amount of rhetoric could erase. The women's choices had struck a nerve. They had revealed that kindness was not exclusive to one culture, that dignity could exist outside the boundaries of empire, and that the power to choose one's life, even in the aftermath of violence, was stronger than the narratives built to contain it, and that, more than anything else, was what colonial society could not forgive. Long after the women themselves had vanished from the frontier, their stories continued to travel, told and retold in churches and longhouses, in newspaper columns and winter lodges, in family letters and public speeches. They shifted shape with every telling, becoming myths, warnings, lessons, or legends depending on who spoke them and why. And yet, beneath those layers of distortion and interpretation, they carried a set of truths that neither side could entirely erase. These stories, born in the violence and intimacy of captivity, outlived the people who lived them. They became part of the cultural memory of both native nations and the colonial societies that once saw them as unthinkable. In native communities, the memory of captive women often took on a tone of integration and resilience. Oral tradition spoke of them not as victims or outsiders, but as ancestors, women who had crossed the boundaries of conflict to become mothers, grandmothers, and matriarchs. In winter storytelling seasons, elders might recount how a woman taken in war brought new knowledge to the people, how she taught different ways of weaving cloth, or introduced new crops, or carried the words of two languages in a single tongue. These were not minor details. They were part of a broader understanding of history as a series of crossings and transformations. Captivity, in this view, was not just a story of loss but a renewal, of enemies becoming kin and strangers becoming family. It revealed a belief deeply rooted in many native cultures, that identity was not fixed, that even in war there was space for new bonds to form and for societies to grow stronger through the people they absorbed. Among colonial Americans, the same stories took on a very different character. Captivity narratives became a popular literary genre in the 18th and 19th centuries, consumed eagerly by readers who saw them as windows into a terrifying and exotic world. Publishers often exaggerated the violence and suffering in these accounts, playing to the fears and prejudices of their audiences. The most dramatic stories, real or imagined, depicted women enduring unspeakable cruelties, narrowly escaping with their faith intact, or being miraculously rescued from barbarism. These tales served multiple purposes. They justified colonial expansion by painting native peoples as savages. They reinforced gender roles by portraying women as helpless and in need of male protection. And they affirmed religious superiority by framing survival as evidence of divine intervention. Even when the actual captives had described kindness, complexity, or even affection, those elements were often stripped away in print, replaced by scenes of horror that fed a colonial appetite for reassurance and control. Yet even these distorted accounts could not fully suppress the more complicated truths that lay beneath them. Some narratives, particularly those written by the captive themselves, refused to conform to simple tropes. Women like Mary Rowlandson or Mary Jemison described their captors with nuance, acknowledging acts of compassion alongside violence, and depicting their experiences as transformative rather than purely traumatic. These more complex stories unsettled readers, hinting at the possibility that the enemy was not a faceless savage but a human being with motives, beliefs, and emotions. They also revealed the deep contradictions in colonial identity. A society that prided itself on civilization and Christianity was often far more brutal towards own prisoners than the people called uncivilized. Over time, the stories evolved again, shaped by changing political needs. During periods of heightened conflict, they were revived as cautionary tales, reminders of supposed dangers of native influence and the necessity of conquest. In more reflective eras, they were retold as parables about reconciliation and shared humanity. For native communities, they remained living stories, woven into genealogies and clan histories. For colonial descendants, they became part of a broader mythology about the frontier, one that mixed fear, fascination, and reluctant respect into a narrative about the forging of a nation. The result was a shared but deeply divided memory. Each side remembered captivity in ways that reflected its own values and anxieties. Yet in both traditions, certain themes endured. The resilience of the human spirit, the capacity of people to change and adapt, the blurred lines between enemy and ally. In their own ways, both native oral histories and colonial captivity narratives spoke to the same truth, that war was not only fought with weapons, but with memory, and that its deepest consequences were not always written in blood, but in the stories people told afterward. These stories, twisted and reshaped over generations, still echo today. They challenge us to question the simple categories of victim and villain, civilized and savage. They remind us that even in the darkest chapters of violence and conquest, there were moments of unexpected humanity, moments when fear gave way to understanding, when strangers became kin, when identities were rewritten by circumstance. And perhaps it is why they've endured for so long, because beneath the myths and distortions lies a deeper record of what it means to be human, caught in the tide of history and remade by the very forces that once sought to destroy us. When the dust of frontier wars finally settled and the names of raids and treaties faded into background of history, what remained were the stories, not just the battles fought and lives lost, but the quiet, unexpected human exchanges that occurred in the spaces between violence. At their core, the captivity narratives and oral traditions born from these encounters revealed something that no musket, no sermon, no political decree could erase. That even amid conquest, displacement, and bloodshed, compassion endured. That dignity could be extended even to one's enemy. That humanity, though tested and reshaped by conflict, was not so easily extinguished. This truth was nowhere more visible than in the treatment of captive women. Their experiences dismantled many of the most deeply held assumptions of societies they came from. They had been taught that war was a line that separated good from evil, civilized from savage, us from them. They had been told that enemies were monsters, incapable of mercy or morality. And yet, many of them were fed before their captors ate, offered shelter in the same lodges where families slept, and treated with a kind of patient restraint when they tried to run. Some were given new names and welcomed into families, not as spoils of war but as daughters, sisters, and wives. Others were asked to share their stories around the fire and listen to with respect they had never expected to find. These were not isolated acts of kindness. They were evidence of a worldview in which captivity was not only about power, but also about transformation, where the outcome of war did not have to be annihilation, but could instead be adoption, incorporation, or renewal. The implications of this were profound. If the people who had been portrayed as brutal enemies were capable of compassion and forgiveness, then the moral order on which colonial expansion had been built began to crack. The simplistic narrative of savages versus settlers, good versus evil, could not withstand the complexity of reality. War had not erased humanity on either side. It had revealed it, sometimes in the most unlikely places. Even acts of violence were often followed by gestures of care. Even amid grief and vengeance, there were attempts to build relationships, to create meaning out of destruction. And for many captives, these contradictions became impossible to ignore. They left them with a new understanding of what it meant to be human, an understanding that was broader, more inclusive, and more complicated than the one they had carried into captivity. This complexity also reshaped ideas about strength and power. Colonial society had long equated power with domination, with chains, prisons, and total submission. But the societies that took captives often demonstrated a different kind of strength, the ability to restrain vengeance, to turn enemy into a relative, to choose patience over punishment. These choices were not signs of weakness, but of confidence, a deep cultural belief that identity was resilient enough to absorb outsiders without being destroyed. The women who experienced this firsthand saw that power could be expressed not only through conquest, but through integration, that dignity could exist even when hierarchies were upended. In the centuries that followed, these stories continue to challenge the way people remembered the past. Colonial authorities and missionaries tried to twist them into tales of manipulation or betrayal, but the deeper truth persisted. Kindness had not been a trick. It was a reflection of deeply held values, of a worldview that saw humanity as something larger than tribe, race, or religion. And those values left their mark not only on the captives who lived among native communities, but also on the societies they returned to. Their testimonies forced uncomfortable questions. If mercy was possible even in the midst of war, then what excuse was there for cruelty in times of peace? If dignity could be extended to an enemy, why was it so often denied to neighbors? Perhaps the greatest revelation of all was how profoundly these encounters blurred the boundaries that war was meant to enforce. They showed that the human spirit could survive captivity without being broken, that identity could evolve without being erased, and that compassion could flourish even where hatred was expected to reign. In the stories of these women, their suffering, their transformation, their choices, we find not just a record of conflict, but a map of human possibility. They remind us that war, for all its brutality, cannot strip people of their capacity to care for one another. It can scar the body and shatter societies, but it cannot silence the deeper instincts that make us human. And in that enduring capacity, in the kindness offered to captives, in the bonds forged between enemies, in the stubborn refusal to see another person as less than human, lies the most enduring legacy of those encounters. A quiet, unshakable proof that humanity survives, even when everything else falls apart.